Sometimes staying silent becomes a mistake. When an HOA starts acting like they own what clearly belongs to you, when they invite guests onto your property without permission, and treat your legal rights like they don't matter, a line has been crossed. This is the story of the day they assumed my land was theirs, and how I reminded them, very loudly, who actually had control. It started like most HOA problems do, quietly, casually, and with a sense of entitlement that only grows when no one challenges it. At first, there were rumors. A neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked near my property. Another casually asked if I was hosting some kind of event. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't scheduled anything. I hadn't rented the land. And I certainly hadn't given permission to anyone, especially not the HOA. When I drove by my property later that day, the truth hit me hard. Strangers were walking around. Cars were parked where they didn't belong. Decorations were being set up. People were acting completely comfortable, like they had every right to be there. And that's when it clicked. The HOA had invited guests onto my land without asking me. No email, no phone call, no notice, no permission, just pure assumption. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of a long-standing HOA mindset, the belief that if they act confidently enough, people will just accept it. That property owners won't push back. That rules only apply one way. What made it worse was how casually they did it. When I finally confronted one of the HOA representatives, their reaction told me everything I needed to know. There was no apology, no embarrassment, just confusion that I was even questioning them. They spoke to me like I was the problem. Oh, it's just for a short time. We assumed it wouldn't be an issue. It's for the community. That word, assumed, is where everything broke. They assumed my land was theirs to use. They assumed my silence meant permission. They assumed I wouldn't fight back. But property rights don't work on assumptions. What the HOA did wasn't just rude or inconsiderate. It was a direct violation of ownership. Inviting guests onto someone else's property without consent isn't a minor mistake, it's trespassing, plain and simple. And the fact that an organized body like an HOA felt comfortable doing this showed how far they believed their authority extended. This wasn't their first overreach. It was just the boldest. HOAs thrive on control. They enforce rules, collect fees, issue warnings, and over time, that power can twist into arrogance. They start believing they are above individual owners. That the community matters more than the law. That private property is flexible when it's inconvenient to respect it. Standing there, watching strangers walk across my land like tourists in a park, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about one event. This was about setting a precedent. If I let this go, it would happen again. And again. And eventually, my ownership would exist only on paper. I thought about all the stories I'd heard. People bullied by HOAs, fined unfairly, ignored, threatened with legal action simply for asking questions. This was exactly how it started. One boundary crossed, followed by another, until resistance feels pointless. But I wasn't willing to play that role. I made it clear that they had no right to be there. That my land was not HOA property. That inviting guests without my consent was unacceptable. Their response? Defensive, dismissive, almost annoyed. They weren't used to hearing no. That moment confirmed something important. They didn't see me as an equal. They saw me as an obstacle. And obstacles, in their minds, are meant to be pushed aside. Instead of backing down, I stepped back, not in defeat, but in strategy. I went home and reviewed everything. The deed, the zoning rules, local regulations, noise ordinances, event permits, rental laws. I wanted to know exactly where I stood, legally, clearly, undeniably. Because if there's one thing that terrifies an overreaching HOA, it's a property owner who understands the law better than they do. The more I researched, the clearer it became, they were wrong. Completely wrong. They had no authority over my land. No right to schedule events. No right to invite guests. No right to assume cooperation. And yet, they had already crossed the line. What angered me most wasn't the inconvenience. It wasn't the noise or the strangers. It was the disrespect, the idea that my consent was optional. That my ownership could be temporarily ignored for their convenience. That's when I realized something crucial. If they wanted to treat my property like a public venue, I could legally treat it like one too. But on my terms. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control. About reminding them that authority has limits, and that those limits are defined by law, not confidence. The HOA had made the first move without thinking. They underestimated me, and they assumed compliance. That assumption would cost them. Because once someone shows you how little they respect your rights, the only responsible response is to make those rights impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what I prepared to do next. After realizing exactly how far the HOA was willing to go, I knew one thing for sure: reacting emotionally would only give them the advantage. That's what they expected: anger, shouting, threats, maybe even a mistake they could later use against me. I wasn't going to give them that. Instead, I chose patience, not the kind that surrenders, but the kind that plans. I spent days researching, reading local laws, zoning regulations, event permits, rental agreements, and noise ordinances. I wanted absolute clarity. I needed to know every boundary, every allowance, every loophole, not to exploit the system, but to operate fully within it. Because when you stay inside the law, power shifts. What I discovered changed everything. My property was legally zoned in a way that allowed short-term rentals and private events, as long as proper procedures were followed. There were restrictions, of course, time limits, safety requirements, and noise curfews, but nothing that prevented me from renting out my land for a legitimate gathering. That's when the idea formed. If the HOA wanted to treat my property like a shared community space, I would remind them, very clearly, that it was a private venue. And I would do it in a way they could not control. I contacted an event coordinator who specialized in non-traditional weddings. During our conversation, one detail stood out. They mentioned working with motorcycle clubs, biker groups who preferred open land, privacy, and freedom from judgment. A biker wedding. The moment those words registered, I knew this wasn't just a response, it was a statement. Not because bikers are trouble, but because HOAs fear what they can't control. Loud engines, leather jackets, music with bass that travels through the ground. A crowd that doesn't fit neatly into HOA expectations. Still, I didn't rush. Every detail had to be perfect. Contracts were drafted, permits were obtained, insurance coverage was confirmed, fire safety approvals were secured for the fireworks. Security was arranged, noise limits were reviewed and respected, right up to the legal maximum. This wasn't chaos. This was calculated. Once everything was in place, I officially rented out my property for the wedding. The agreement was clean, legal, and airtight. The event had a schedule. Start time, end time, safety measures. There was nothing the HOA could challenge. And that's what made it powerful. I didn't inform the HOA ahead of time. I wasn't required to. Just like they hadn't informed me when they invited guests onto my land. Fair is fair. On the day of the event, the atmosphere shifted early. The sound of motorcycle engines echoed through the area as bikers began arriving in groups. Not aggressive, not disorderly, just confident, unapologetic, and present. Their bikes lined the entrance to my land, a visual reminder that this was no longer an HOA-controlled environment. The wedding setup was respectful but bold. Decorations reflected freedom and individuality. Music testing started well within legal limits, but loud enough to be unmistakable. The message was already being delivered without a single word spoken. I watched from a distance as HOA board members slowly realized what was happening. Confusion turned into panic. Phones came out. Conversations became heated. They tried to find violations, parking issues, noise complaints, permit problems. There were none. Every box was checked. The fireworks were scheduled for later that evening, approved and timed precisely to comply with local regulations. When they finally lit up the sky, the effect was dramatic, not reckless, but unforgettable. Bright colors exploded overhead, reflecting off chrome motorcycles and stunned faces. The HOA had lost control of the narrative, and that was the point. They couldn't stop the event. They couldn't fine me. They couldn't threaten legal action. Because everything happening was lawful. What made the situation even more satisfying was the contrast. The bikers were polite, organized, and respectful. There was no vandalism, no fights, no destruction, just a celebration, one that happened to shatter the HOA's illusion of authority. That illusion had been their strongest weapon. By staying calm, prepared, and within the law, I had taken it away. This wasn't about embarrassing anyone. It was about setting a boundary so clear that it could never be crossed again. The HOA had assumed my land was theirs to manage. That assumption ended the moment I exercised my rights publicly and confidently. Throughout the event, I felt something I hadn't felt since this started: control. Not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that comes from standing firm in what you own and what the law protects. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to explain myself repeatedly. The law spoke for me. And it spoke loudly. By the end of the night, the message was undeniable. My property was not an extension of HOA power. It was independent, protected, and untouchable. The biker wedding wasn't revenge. It was education, an unforgettable lesson that authority has limits, and ownership still means something, especially when you're willing to defend it intelligently. And as the fireworks faded and engines roared away into the night, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The HOA would never again assume they could use my land without asking. The real impact of that night didn't end when the last firework faded or when the final motorcycle disappeared down the road. In many ways, that was only the beginning. The aftermath was where the lesson truly settled in, slow, uncomfortable, and impossible for the HOA to erase. The morning after the event, the energy in the neighborhood had completely changed. The confidence the HOA once carried was gone. There were no more casual assumptions, no more quiet oversteps. Everything felt cautious, careful, measured, and that silence spoke volumes. Within days, I started noticing small but telling shifts. HOA emails that once sounded commanding were suddenly polite. Phrases like, as per community expectations, were replaced with owner approval. It wasn't subtle, it was survival. They had learned something important. Power only works when people believe in it. Behind closed doors, I later learned that the HOA board had panicked that night. They had contacted legal counsel, desperately searching for any violation they could use against me. Noise complaints, safety issues, unauthorized gatherings. They found nothing. Every permit was valid. Every regulation was followed. Every deadline was respected. The law had drawn a line, and they were standing on the wrong side of it. That realization shook them. What truly rattled the HOA wasn't the bikers or the fireworks. It was the fact that I had exposed their greatest weakness. Their authority was conditional. It depended on owners not knowing their rights, not asking questions, and not pushing back. Once that illusion broke, everything changed. Neighbors began to approach me quietly. Some thanked me. Others shared their own stories, fines that never made sense, warnings issued without explanation, pressure to comply with rules that felt arbitrary. For years, they had assumed resistance was pointless. Now, they weren't so sure. The HOA had unintentionally created a symbol, and I happened to be it. Not because I was loud or aggressive, but because I stayed calm and used the system correctly. That's what made it powerful. I didn't break rules to prove a point. I followed them better than the HOA ever had. And that scared them more than chaos ever could. In the weeks that followed, the HOA attempted damage control. New meetings were announced. Revised guidelines were circulated. Suddenly, transparency mattered. Suddenly, owner consent was emphasized. They were trying to regain credibility. But once authority cracks, it never fully heals. I was invited, politely, to discuss future coordination. The tone was almost respectful. Almost. They wanted assurance that I wouldn't do something like that again. I listened, I nodded, and I made one thing very clear. As long as my property was respected, there would be no problems. The moment my rights were ignored again, I would respond, legally, publicly, and confidently. There was nothing they could say to that. Because I had already proven it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. From that point on, interactions with the HOA became strictly procedural. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Everything in writing. Every request documented. Every decision traceable. That shift alone was worth everything. The neighborhood itself began to feel different too. Not louder. Not rebellious. Just more aware. People paid attention to notices. They read fine print. They asked questions during meetings. Knowledge had spread, and knowledge is dangerous to unchecked authority. The biker wedding had become a story people whispered about, then laughed about, then proudly referenced. Not because it was wild, but because it was smart. Because it showed that standing up for yourself didn't require confrontation, it required preparation. What stayed with me most was the realization of how close I came to losing control without noticing. If I hadn't spoken up that first day, if I had brushed it off as just one event, the precedent would have been set. One small silence can cost you everything. That experience changed how I approached ownership. I became more involved, more aware, more confident, not just about my property, but about my voice. The HOA never apologized. Organizations like that rarely do. But they didn't need to. Their behavior was the apology. They stopped crossing lines. They stopped assuming. They stopped testing boundaries. Because boundaries had been reinforced in a way they couldn't ignore. Looking back, the night of the biker wedding wasn't about noise or spectacle. It was about clarity. A clear message delivered without shouting, without insults, without breaking a single rule. Just facts. Just rights. Just consequences. And that's why it worked. People often think standing up for yourself has to be dramatic. That it requires anger or conflict. But sometimes, the strongest response is quiet confidence backed by preparation. That's what the HOA learned. They learned that ownership isn't symbolic. It isn't flexible. And it isn't theirs to redefine. It belongs to the person who understands it, and is willing to defend it. Long after the fireworks were forgotten and the engines stopped echoing, the lesson remained. Written into every email, reflected in every cautious decision, embedded in how the HOA operated from that day forward. My land was never questioned again. And that, more than anything else, was the real victory.